In this episode, I'm sharing a very personal journey, how I worked through grief in a self-hypnosis session. It's about grief, but it's also about how I became a coach, what I learned through my own healing, and the techniques I now use with my clients. You'll get a sense of what a session with me can look like. Grief is something we all encounter at some point, either personally or while supporting someone else. And it's something we rarely give enough space. If anything in this episode feels like too much, please take care of yourself, stop when necessary, and come back another day. And if you are going through something similar or feel stuck somewhere, feel free to reach out. Let's get into it. How did I end up working on grief? The simple answer would be by accident. But when you work with the subconscious, you know nothing really shows up by accident. 2 years ago, I was still in my hypnotherapy training and I practiced all the techniques on myself first through self-hypnosis. That was incredibly helpful. I learned all the tools, I learned a lot about myself, and I changed so many things in my inner world. Like, in many ways, I'm not the same person I was back then, and in other ways, of course, I still am. The thing is, when you work with your subconscious every day, it changes you. So back then, I was looking for topics I could coach myself on. And while I was doing so, suddenly my grandparents came to my mind. And I thought, okay, if you're showing up, I guess I'll look at it. And it surprised me because the loss in my family, my grandmother's death, happened almost 30 years ago. I didn't think there was anything left to process. My grandma died in 1996. She simply lay down for a nap and never woke up again. For her, probably a peaceful way to go. For the rest of us, it was sudden and shocking. And at that point, my grandfather was demented, though we didn't fully understand how bad his state really was, because my grandmother had cared for him for years. And she never asked for help, she never complained, she always put herself last, and then she was just gone. I had planned to visit her that day. I came home ready to leave with my parents, and instead, she wasn't there anymore. My parents had already left without me to deal with things that they never thought about that they would have to deal with. I mean, back then, we all assumed my grandfather would be the one to go first because he had been sick for a while. We didn't think that she would be the one to leave us. So, what happens back then next was that my grandfather moved in with us. I was the only child still living at home, and we had a spare room. Over the next month, he moved in with us, and while he did so, it became clear how severe his dementia really was. And it put our whole family under enormous strain. I, back then, was a teenager and not exactly equipped with patience or understanding for a demented grandfather, especially because I was the only person he didn't recognize anymore. And because in my teenage grief, I blamed him for my grandmother's death. My brain thought he was the problem, he exhausted her, she gave everything for him. And that made me really despise him back then and for the following years. But over time, my perspective on that matter changed because my grandmother was trapped in her own worldview, in her role. She never asked for help. She could have taken care of herself, but she didn't. So blaming my grandfather wasn't fair. My mind understood that eventually, but my heart didn't. So my intention when I did do the self-hypnosis was release that anger toward my grandfather that was still lingering and let the clarity that he wasn't to blame for my grandma's death reached my whole system. So what I did was I started the self-hypnosis and I went back into time, back into the year 1996. And the interesting thing is my subconscious brought up a scene I hadn't connected to the grief at all. So suddenly I was back in my childhood bedroom and my grandfather was standing there in the middle of the night. And that really had happened. And I had been terrified because he got confused. He wanted to go to the bathroom, but he ended up in my room. And for a moment, there was pure panic in me. And that moment was still there in my system. So I worked with that scene. I reminded myself that nothing happened, that I was safe, that he was confused. And I told my younger self, you'll go back to sleep and he will never walk into your room at night again. And when this perspective change had happened, my system softened. Then I looked at my sense of time, that period with my grandfather that felt endless, but in reality, it was only a few months, not even half a year. On the scale of my lifetime, that's nothing. So I wanted to change that. And by the way, that happens really often in our subconscious, that a certain time in our life is completely out of shape, looks bigger or feels longer than in reality it really was. So that is a common practice I do. And back then I did that too. I adjusted the timeline internally and made it match reality. That brought even more calmness into my system. And then there came a real insight. I wasn't grieving the situation. I was grieving the love. I realized for the first time how deeply I had loved my grandmother. I knew she was important to me, but I have never understood before the depth of that. And suddenly in that hypnosis, I was crying because it hit me. She meant the world to me and she was just gone. And nobody held space for that because everyone else around me was in survival mode. Clearing the apartment, organizing the funeral, taking care of my grandfather, making move in with us, bam, bam, bam. I never got to finish grieving. So I did it back then, back in the self-hypnosis. Decades later, I let everything out. I did grieve. And with that came the next realization, one that I now share with anyone who grieves. The love wasn't gone. It had never left. Even after almost 30 years, the love was still there. I could feel it. I could feel it again. It wasn't dead. It wasn't lost. It was simply buried under everything else. After I had that aha moment, I looked at my grandfather again and I worked with the inner image of him because in my inner world, the inner image of him had changed and was really focused onto that sick, confused, demented man. But that grandfather wasn't my grandfather. He was just a part of him. So I got back to the grandfather of my childhood, the one who played with me, the one who cared for me, the one who made me laugh. And I brought that version of him back into focus. Because we can decide how we remember situations and how we remember people. And it's a really important step in a lot of healing journeys. Finally, I anchored a memory, and that memory was me sitting between my grandparents. And I filled it with all the calm and clarity and love that I had established in that process so far. And that love is still with me today. My grandparents have been gone for decades, but the love that they had for me, it didn't die with them. It lives as long as I can remember it. And I can draw from it whenever I need it. That was one of the most important insights I have ever had. And I ended that session feeling deeply loved and with a sense of lightness and joy I hadn't felt in a long time. And afterwards, something happened that hadn't happened in years. I wrote a poem, and those words just came to me. And I do want to use those words to end this episode. And then she was gone. No more words, only missed chances. What remained? Grief, anger, guilt, and shame. Tears dried too quickly, not flowing enough. Anger fed year after year. Guilt heavy, dark. Shame, mind and feeling out of sync. Forgotten, put away, fading memory. And then, half a lifetime later, taking a closer look, getting back into the feeling. Allowing grief, tears, release, relief, making peace. Anger, guilt, and shame fade, dissolve. Only grief remains raw, close. And the realization that there was so much there, so much love and warmth, so much light and joy. Back then, the loss, no love without her. And today, the insight that as long as the memory lives in my heart, so does the love, unconditionally.